This is Christopher Sernaque hosting episode 11 of season 5 of the Current Topics in Science podcast. This podcast will address breaking scientific news in light of the origins debate and host interviews with scientists. Today we'll be talking with Dr. Brian Miller about the physics behind the universe and life. This podcast is available on the following platforms: iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcast, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. Video recordings of the podcast will be uploaded to YouTube. Enjoy the podcast. Today on Current Topics in Science, we have the honor of hosting Dr. Brian Miller. Dr. Miller obtained a Bachelor of Science degree in physics with a minor in engineering from MIT, a Ph.D. in complex systems physics from Duke University, and is an expert in the physics of thermodynamics and information theory. Dr. Miller is the research coordinator for the Center of Science and Culture at the Discovery Institute, helps to manage the ID 3.0 research program, and was the primary organizer of the Conference on Engineering in the Life Sciences. He's also consulted on organizational development and strategic planning, and he's a founding member of an innovation consortium that developed into The Startup, a virtual incubator dedicated to bringing innovation to the marketplace. He's contributed to multiple books and technical journals covering the debate over intelligent design, including The Mystery of Life's Origin, The Continuing Controversy, The Comprehensive Guide to Science and Faith, and Inference Review. He's a regular contributor to Evolution News and Science Today and the ID The Future podcast. And now, without further ado, good afternoon, Dr. Miller. How was your day and how are you doing?
Oh, it's been really wonderful, and it's such a pleasure to be here with you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Miller. I'm very glad to have you on Current Topics in Science. And since this is Current Topics in Science, let's quickly look at this week's current topic. Today we're going to start off by looking at a quotation from a piece in the Marshall News Messenger by Dr. Jerry Hopkins, a retired professor, columnist, and a historian. Dr. Hopkins quotes reads as follows: "Several eminent thinkers, philosophers, and scientists have come to question Darwinism and even evolution as a viable theory regarding the origins of living creatures. The basic elements of humanity, morals, ethics, thinking, religion, cannot find reasonable explanation in the totally materialistic theory of Darwin with its insistence on random chance, material processes." Dr. Miller, what do you think of this quote from Dr. Hopkins, and may you please expand upon these ideas?
Yeah, certainly. And when people use the word Darwinism, that's obviously referring to Charles Darwin's idea of natural selection and adaptation. And that's been sort of the standard theory for multiple decades. But what's happened is top-level theorists, evolutionary theorists, have come to recognize that it can't actually explain the large-scale transformations in life. So, for instance, there was a 2016 meeting at the Royal Society in London on new trends in evolutionary biology. And one of the leading theorists was Gert Muller. And in his opening talk, he talked about how the standard evolutionary model, neo-Darwinism, is really helpful if you're looking at things like finch beaks getting smaller or larger. But if you're trying to explain how, let's say, a fish became an amphibian or how a bacteria became a complex organism, it is hopelessly inadequate. And during the series of sessions in London, there were many attempts to try to explain how some other sub-theory might fill the explanatory gaps. But nobody presented a single piece of evidence that any other idea could explain these large-scale transformations in nature. So currently, there's a recognition that the neo-Darwinian model cannot explain the large-scale transformations in life, and there really is nothing to replace it. That's the sort of situation we have today.
Thank you for covering that quotation, Dr. Miller. And as Dr. Hopkins mentioned, there are more scientists questioning whether or not evolutionary materialistic ideas can explain the origin of living creatures via material processes. And that's why we're going to be covering both the physics behind the origin of life and the universe. Speaking of which, Dr. Miller, as an expert in thermodynamics, What do you think of this quotation from Dr. Sarfati? He states, "If the total amount of mass energy is limited and the amount of usable energy is decreasing, then the universe cannot have existed forever. Otherwise, it would have already have exhausted all usable energy, the heat death of the universe." Dr. Miller, including thermodynamics, what evidence from physics do we have that suggests that our universe had a beginning?
Yeah, and that's a classic issue that people that study cosmology or our universe have recognized. Because what happened is when Einstein's theory of general relativity became accepted, it implied that our universe had a beginning. And this was really disturbing because if our universe began, that means that something outside of time and space had to begin it, which had very deep theological implications. Many scientists were very concerned about this, people like Fred Hoyle. So he and others tried to get around this problem by coming up with different models of the universe. So he came up with sort of the steady state model. Others came up with an oscillating model where universes would expand and then contract and bounce and expand. But that quote, as you read, deals with a serious problem. And that's, as time goes on, our universe is running out of energy that would be useful for things like igniting stars or for driving photosynthesis. So what's going to happen eventually is our universe is going to become just this cold, dead state of a very diffuse soup of photons and other particles in space. All the stars will be gone, and everything will just be inert. Well, that means if you go back in time, you have to imagine that there's more and more useful free energy, and in fact, also lower and lower entropy. So if you go back in time, that means there had to be a beginning because your entropy can only go so small. So that's very much the evidence is pointing to a beginning.
So, Dr. Miller, I'm hearing you say that the scientific evidence is pointing inexorably to the fact that the universe had a beginning. And on that note, not all physicists or scientists would agree that the universe had a beginning. In episode 7 of the Discovery Institute's Psi Uprising series, you covered several of these models, like the oscillating universe idea that was popularized by Carl Sagan. Dr. Miller, in your view, what evidence leads you to the conclusion that a universal beginning is best understood in light of the theory of intelligent design rather than competing purely naturalistic or materialistic theories?
Yeah, so what you find is that if you look at the evidence that's clear, that's well established, it all points to this idea that the universe had a beginning. Time, space, matter, and energy all began. And that strongly points to the idea that there is a creator outside of time and space that started everything. But people try to get around this problem. And a classic example is like Paul Steinhardt, who originally developed what's called inflationary cosmology, but later rejected it. And he came with a more modern version of the oscillating universe. And that's the idea. His idea is basically the universe expands, it then stops, it contracts. It doesn't go all the way back to a singularity type event, but then it contracts a little bit, but then expands a lot more. So the universe is always getting larger and larger. And he attempted to argue that this oscillating model did not need a beginning. Well, the problem is you have people like from the University of Buffalo who published an article in the Journal of Cosmology and Astroparticle Physics, Will Kinney and Nina Sein. And what they argued is that the Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem actually does apply to Steinhardt's model. Now, the Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem is this theorem developed by some very famous astrophysicists, cosmologists, and it shows that any universe on average which is expanding must have had a beginning. And his model falls in that category. Now, another attempt to get around the beginning is by Roger Penrose. And Roger Penrose is, again, a legendary cosmologist and physicist. And he talked about the fact that our universe started in a remarkably low entropy state. And he's the one that came up with that amazing calculation that the chance of the universe being in such a low entropy state is like 1 over 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 123. But he came up with a more recent model called basically a conformal cyclical cosmology model, where he tried to argue that what happens is that the universe expands, and then as it starts to run out of free energy, a crossover event takes place, and then it starts to basically start over as a new Big Bang event. And what happens is his model also faces serious problems because he has to assume certain laws of physics that don't make sense. For instance, he has to assume that electrons lose their mass at the end of the universe, which doesn't really match with particle physics. He also has to assume that there's this phantom field, and it has no physical reality. It's just a mathematical element until this crossover event, where suddenly it becomes a real field, which grows in mass and then sort of drives a new Big Bang event and starts things off again, or stops expansion in his case. And what happens with all these models is, to avoid the beginning, they have to create all these ad hoc assumptions, which are not supported by evidence, and they have to invoke incredible levels of fine-tuning for their mechanisms actually to work. So again, their attempts to get rid of a beginning to avoid a creator simply forces them to apply enormous levels of fine-tuning, which again points to a creator. So it doesn't really avoid the problem. And the last attempt is by Sean Carroll, and what he argued is that you have kind of a singularity event, and then it expands forward and backward in time, so that the universe is actually growing infinitely large in the infinite past. And the problem with that model is he has to assume essentially infinite amounts of fine-tuning to contract into this very special Big Bang type event and then expand again. So in every attempt to avoid the beginning, people have to propose ideas that are not supported by any evidence. They're kind of ad hoc assumptions. And they have to impose enormous levels of fine-tuning in these models, so that they have to be very carefully designed to avoid the beginning. But again, that just points to a creator. So in order to avoid the beginning, the evidence of a creator in a beginning, they have to appeal to a creator in a practical sense to explain the fine-tuning that makes their models work. So in other words, the details of their models have to be perfectly set for them to work to avoid a beginning.
Dr. Miller, in other words, it sounds like a universal beginning is best understood in the parameters of the intelligent design theory. Christopher Hitchens, one of the new atheists, said something similar when he said that the anthropic principle is the best argument for intelligent design. Hitchens stated, "At some point, certainly, we are all asked which is the best argument you've come up against from the other side." And by other side, he means the idea advocates. I think every one of us picks the fine-tuning one as the most intriguing. Dr. Miller, can you please explain what the anthropic principle is and if it is evidence for the theory of intelligent design?
Yeah, the anthropic principle, the term was coined by a person named Brandon Carter, who was a physicist, and he described what was called the weak anthropic principle. And it's pretty straightforward. It simply says that our universe had to have the conditions that would allow for life. And that's somewhat of a truism because we're here, therefore the conditions had to be right for us to be here. So that's pretty straightforward. But then there's others, the people like Frank Tipler, who came up with more of a strong anthropic principle. And that's the idea that the universe must have had the right conditions for an intelligent carbon-based organism to emerge. So this deals more with teleology or purpose, that there's something about our universe that seems to have been designed for the purpose of supporting life. That's the basic idea. And what's also really important is that strongly points to design. And here's why. If you imagined that you had a machine, and this machine could generate universes, it has lots and lots of dials. You can control the universe you create. So you can turn one dial and gravity is stronger, another dial, gravity is weaker, another dial, the electromagnetic force that holds electrons and protons together is stronger or weaker. Another dial controls the entropy of the early universe, and so forth. That many of these dials have to be very carefully set for a universe that supports life. So for instance, if the force that holds electrons and protons together were just a few percent larger or smaller, or the force that holds the nucleus together was a few percent larger or smaller, there wouldn't be enough carbon or oxygen in the universe to support life. Other dials are much more extreme. So in case of gravity, if you imagine the reasonable range you'd expect gravity could have been to allow for life in the universe is something like 1/10 to the power of 35. And that would be like selecting one atom in our entire planet. So again, what you see is clear evidence that a mind designed our universe very carefully with life in mind.
Dr. Miller, thank you very much for covering the anthropic principle. And since we've now seen that the universe is designed for life, we're going to cover the second topic in our interview together. We'll be investigating whether or not there is design in life. Dr. Miller, on Evolution News, you wrote a brief article called The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Engineering in Biological Sciences. This article links to your presentation called The Surprising Relevance of Engineering in Biology. Dr. Miller, what is the relevance of engineering in biology, and how does viewing biology from a design perspective increase a fruitful understanding of that field?
This is really one of my favorite topics to discuss because it's so significant. Because if you were to talk to any evolutionist or anyone who believes in design over the last several decades, and you ask, what are the different predictions of those two models? Well, evolution predicts, or any blind, undirected process, is that life should often be poorly designed, clumsy, inefficient, suboptimal, or even non-functional. And there's several mathematical models, there's theoretical analyses that all point in this direction. And if you happen to read Stephen Jay Gould, like The Panda's Thumb, or Nathan Lentz's book, Human Errors, you get this basic idea that evolution predicts a lot of what you see in life should be suboptimal, poorly designed because it wasn't planned. There's no planning in advance. It should also look more like what's called the Rube Goldberg machine. But that's what evolution predicts. Because there's no planning, there's no foresight, the idea is you have something that develops by chance, like a protein or a little molecular machine. And then over time, purely by chance, that things kind of come together randomly, they shuffle around, and you get something more complex that wasn't designed in advance, but it may work in a very clumsy way. That's a Rube Goldberg machine. Also, what you would expect from an evolutionary perspective is that it shouldn't look like human engineering. Because the idea of evolution is that you have this random search through possibilities, and you eventually stumble across something that does something useful, like propulsion. And the chance of you finding something that looks like human engineering would be pretty minimal. Well, obviously, a design perspective assumes the opposite. We assume that life is optimized, that you see top-down design. And by top-down design, what you mean is that a mind planned the design of an organism in advance. Like if you're going to design a car, in advance, you say, I need an engine, I need a steering system, I need transmission, but everything is designed with this overarching purpose in mind of having a car, for instance. And everything is optimized to fit perfectly and symphonically with everything else because there's a mind that had foresight, it planned in advance. And that's what you see in life, is this picture of top-down design. Also, what happens is you see that many of the design patterns in life are the same design patterns that we use in human engineering. So what you find is all of the assumptions that are driven by evolution have shifted. So biologists, like particularly in the field of systems biologists, have had to abandon very often the evolutionary assumptions and embrace design assumptions. So for instance, there's like a Professor Balick at Princeton, and he's written very eloquently on how living systems often work at such a high efficiency that it approaches the maximum efficiency possible based on the physics. That would be like sensory systems, that would be things like DNA translation. It's truly amazing. And what's happened is people in the past have always assumed that certain things in life were suboptimal, they're poorly designed, like things like the eye, the appendix, different things like that. But as engineers and more experienced biologists have looked at these systems, they consistently find that they're actually optimized. They're highly optimal design. And the only reason that biologists originally assumed they were poorly designed is they didn't fully understand the biology or principles of engineering. And what's happened is these shifting assumptions have really described a revolution taking place in biology. And many people will call it a revolution, even among mainstream biologists, particularly in systems biology. And the reason this revolution is taking place is because what you find is engineers are bringing their expertise to the table in studying living systems. A second advancement is when our ability to study the cell has become more advanced, we're able to see what's happening in greater detail. We're starting to see the complexity of the ingenuity, the details of the operations. And both the advances in our science and the conversations with engineering have what brought this revolution, where, again, bringing this design perspective to biology is advancing the field dramatically. So when engineers look at life, what they can do is they can see this we use, and then that allows them to make predictions about how this system works and helps them to understand how things work together. And examples of that would be like feedback loops, control systems, four-bar linkages. So again, what you're finding is this design perspective is what's defining the biology of the 21st and 22nd century.
Dr. Miller, thank you very much for that explanation. And speaking of engineering in nature, as a paper in Nature Reviews, Molecular Cell Biology states, today, biology is revealing the importance of molecular machines and of other highly organized molecular structures that carry out the complex physico-chemical processes on which life is based. Dr. Miller, what testable predictions does the theory of intelligent design make concerning biological machines?
So the predictions from a design perspective is when you look at these machines, they will be highly optimized because an evolutionary process or an incremental process can optimize an existing design logic. So if you have a car, you can improve the car by moving the seat up, moving the seat back, tweaking your mirrors. But what evolution cannot do is it can't optimize the logic itself. But evolutionary processes cannot create a new design logic. But what you find in these machines in life is that they're optimized. The logic is optimized. Everything about them is optimized. Also, you see a very clear idea of top-down design, that you can tell how a mind planned everything in advance and planned on how this thing would fit together with other systems in symphonic harmony. Also, what you can do is you can look at the design logic, compare it to human engineering, and make predictions of what you'll find. And a very, and sort of an iconic example of this is a series of papers done by Dean Schultz. And Dean Schultz is an engineer and computer scientist, and he worked with biologists to understand how a bacterial flagellum worked. And what happens is Dean Schultz said, if I were going to design this, how would I do it? So before he looked at the biology, he said, what would the systems be? What would be the subsystems? What would be the interconnections? What would be the constraints? And then he looked at the biology. And he started to look at how everything works, how everything connects. And then he was able to bring those two analyses together and synthesize them. And what he found was that he was able to anticipate a remarkable number of features, large-scale features and even small-scale features for the flagellum. And the reason for that is there's very few ways, very few solutions to many engineering problems. So the fact that this flagellum operates so similarly to human engineering is because there's only a very small number of ways to have a rotary propulsion system. And the engineering logic is constrained to an incredible degree. So what he was also able to do is determine a lot of the constraints. Many details had to be right for it to operate properly. And by bringing his engineering insights to the table, his top-down analysis, he was able to come up with ideas and explanations and insights that you're not able to do, that no one was able to do simply by assuming it was the product of this blind, undirected process.
Oh, wow, that was an amazing answer, Dr. Miller. Well, one of the things that I've always wondered, since the bacterial flagellum is so incredibly designed, have we ever tried to copy it in a biomimical sense?
Great question. What you find is one of a really burgeoning field is biomimicry. And one of the leaders of this is Stuart Burgess, who's looked at the design of living systems and copied that with things like your knee joints, things like a drone that models a dragonfly. The challenge, though, is so much of what happens in a cell operates in the nanotechnology realm at nanoscales, very small scales. And the physics at that level is very different. So humans are at a very, very primitive stage of nanotechnology. There are leaders in the field like Jim Tour that are doing some amazing structures, but everything we do pales in comparison to what happens in life. Because one of the frameworks that helps people understand life is that studying life is not studying a system like geology or chemistry. But what the study of life really is, or biology, is reverse engineering a technology far more advanced than our own. So what happens is a lot of the technology in life is way beyond what we're capable of doing. So we are able to mimic some of it, but it's really, really hard because we are just not as smart as the creator is. So as our knowledge increases, we'll probably be able to mimic it at a greater level. That's the future.
Thank you so much for sharing these predictions about biological machines. And while we're on the subject, there are several iconic biological machines, like as what you just mentioned, the bacterial flagellum, the adenosine triphosphate synthase, and the kinesin linear motor. Dr. Miller, what other biological machines have been discovered that demonstrate intelligent design?
Well, one of my favorites is what's called topoisomerase, and this is a protein cluster. And there's a beautiful video of topoisomerase on the Discovery channel and on YouTube. And what it is, it's kind of like if you imagine the number eight, or the number eight, you have, let's say, two halves of the eight, where the two halves would touch at the top, it would touch at the bottom, and it would touch in the middle. And what happens with this topoisomerase, it's kind of like that. You have these three gates. You've got a gate at the bottom, at the top, and a gate in the middle. And what this topoisomerase does is it untangles DNA. So if you've got two strands of DNA that are tangled together, almost like if you ever looked at the old phone cords back in the old days, it would tangle together. And what this topoisomerase does is these tangled DNA strands would go through the top gate would close, the bottom gate would pull apart, it would break apart one of the strands, then the other strand would pass through the broken strand, and then the gate would close up the strand and mend it back together. And then the bottom gate would let one DNA strand go, and the top gate, the other DNA strand go. So it's this incredibly sophisticated machinery that untangles DNA. And what's amazing about this is you have to have this for a cell to work. Because if you're going to duplicate DNA, if you're going to access DNA, you've got to pull the DNA apart. And when you pull it apart, it tangles. So this topoisomerase had to be there at the very instant life was created, because without it, you couldn't have replication. Another amazing machine is the ribosome, because what happens in DNA translation is you have DNA, and DNA is kind of like Morse code, except instead of having dots and dashes, you have 4 letters in DNA. And if you take 3 of those 4 letters and put them together, like AAA or TTT, that's called a codon. And every codon will map to a single amino acid. And proteins are composed of amino acid. There's about 20 amino acids typically used in proteins, in the same way you've got like 26 letters in an alphabet. So these amino acids will form a chain, which then folds into a protein. Well, what happens is for this translation to take place, to go from DNA to proteins, you've got to have this beautiful thing called a ribosome. And what the ribosome does is you'll feed in your mRNA, which is kind of like your digital code for your proteins. And then what happens is you've got these molecules called tRNA. And what they do is they take an amino acid, they bring the amino acid into the ribosome, and they match up with your RNA. And this basically translates the RNA digital code into your protein sequences. It's absolutely stunning. And this is a machine which is incredibly sophisticated, and multiple components have to be there for it to work at even the most basic level. And of course, one of the greatest example is a cell itself. In fact, there was a really beautiful paper by Sernaque and Reeves, and it was basically on how do you look at systems modeling of a cell. And what this paper did is it said basically a cell is an embedded computing system. And you look at, let's say, a human design embedded computing system, you have component for component, it lines up beautifully. You've got information processing, you've got timing, you've got control gates, all these different things. So it's a wonderful picture of how you see amazing engineering in life. And by applying our engineering understanding, we can elucidate it more at a greater and greater level.
Thank you very much for covering that, Dr. Miller. Now, even though these machine evidences sound quite compelling, there are scientists who would disagree with the idea that these machines are best explained by the theory of intelligent design, and that the theory of evolution can account for such machines. For instance, there's a Cornell University paper called Theoretical Perspectives on Biological Machines, which states biological machines have evolved to transport cargo, facilitate folding of proteins and RNA, remodel chromatin, and replicate DNA. A common aspect of these machines is that their functions are driven out of equilibrium. Dr. Miller, do you find evolutionary explanations for biological machines convincing? And if not, why not?
Well, first of all, I want to say that it really comes down to your assumptions, your philosophical assumptions about reality. So if you assume that there is no creator, that all that exists is matter, time, space, and energy, and that's all there is, we're in a closed system, then you have to assume everything evolved. That's just a faith commitment. You can't question it. You have to assume life came about by chance through natural processes. You have to assume our planet is so perfectly designed for life purely by chance. And you have to assume that everything you see in life is evolved. But if you don't assume that, if you think that it's possible that there is a designer, then the design explanation makes a lot more sense. Because here's the bottom line. There are no detailed evolutionary explanations for anything of significance. It's all just storytelling. It's just hand-waving. And I'm not trying to be disrespectful. I mean, I know that evolutionists are doing what makes sense in their philosophical framework. But once you step out of that framework, what you realize is there is no substance to these stories. What happens is when you read an evolutionary text and they talk about the origin of something like the flagellum, it's kind of like reading a Harry Potter novel. Because what happens is they invoke words like magical incantations. Like, how did the flagellum come about? It was through co-option, that you've got all these different subcomponents and other machines, and they just kind of came to form the flagellum. And that sounds nice until you look at the details of the biology. And as soon as you look at the details, it makes absolutely no sense. Because if you look at the proteins or the components in a flagellum that are even remotely similar to what's in other systems, what you have to do is, if you want to use it in a flagellum, you have to re-engineer it. And you have to create an assembly process, and you have to create a control system. So again, these are not serious scientific explanations, they're just invoking words. Another example is they'll invoke the word like co-evolution in a symbiotic relationship. They just say, well, it co-evolved. Here again, when you look at the details of the biology, the story collapses because you need too many changes at once. And you have to invoke foresight for this thing to work together. So again, the evolutionary quote unquote explanations are completely unconvincing because they only make sense if you ignore the details of the biology. In contrast, when you look at a design framework, everything makes sense because every aspect of life, you've got top-down design, you've got planning, you've got foresight, you've got the implementation of control systems, assembly processes. You see the same logic that we use in our engineering. So the design framework is the only framework that will help you to understand these details of life.
Thank you very much for covering that objection, Dr. Miller. And along those same lines, is it the case that attributing design to biological machines is an example of an argument from incredulity, or a god of the gap? So basically, I don't know how evolution could have produced this, therefore God made it. What would you say to that objection, Dr. Miller?
Well, that objection, it really is from a deep philosophical assumption. It's called scientific materialism. It's the assumption that everything that we see is a product of undirected processes. So yeah, if you assume that that's the case, then anytime you invoke design, it has to be a god of the gaps. It has to be the case that one day, potentially, science could discover how this thing came about through some natural process. But if that's not your philosophical assumption, if you start by saying that what we see in nature could be the product of physical processes, or it might be the product of design, if you have design on the table, then what you see in life only makes sense from the perspective of design. Because what you actually see is a materialism of the gaps fallacy, because there's design prevalent everywhere. Design in the laws of nature, design in our planet, design in life, the evidence of purpose, foresight, goal direction, coordination, by appealing to some fanciful storytelling, or some rationalization like a multiverse. But as science advances, what you find is those stories consistently collapse, and the positive evidence for design increasingly gets stronger. And also what you find is that people who are coming from the assumption of scientific materialism have greatly underestimated the ingenuity in life. And I call this the imperfection of the gaps fallacy, because if a biologist doesn't immediately understand something, like, for instance, the panda's thumb or our eye, which has a wiring, which is quote unquote backwards, then they'll say that what I don't understand, I think it's because of poor design. But as science advances and you bring engineers to the table, what inevitably happens is what people used to think was poor design, we now know is optimally designed. Because the truth is the exact opposite. And I want to really hammer this point home with a story, an analogy. So let's imagine that a spaceship crashes somewhere in Area 51. And NASA and the government come together and they form two teams of scientists to really understand the spaceship. One team doesn't believe in aliens. They assume that it has to be the product of natural processes. And the second team believes that it could be produced by aliens. Well, how would they go about studying it? Well, there may have been volcanoes that would produce molten metal. That metal would go into the crevices of rocks, which would form spaceship parts. And then tornadoes and earthquakes and tsunamis would move these spaceship parts together and assemble them to form a functional spaceship. Now, that research project would get nowhere. And that's what you see in Origin of Life. What you find is that Origin of Life researchers have made no progress over 70 years to understand how life came about. In contrast, if you assume the spaceship is designed, you'll bring engineers to the table. You'll certainly look at the physics and the chemistry, but you'll ask, how does a spaceship resemble human engineering? You'll look at the top-down design. You look at similarities between its subsystems and something like a control system or a propulsion system. And when you apply that framework to life, you make enormous progress. Again, the whole God of the Gaps argument is looking at the world in the way that's completely backwards.
Dr. Miller, we've now come to our final question. As the author of the Comprehensive Guide to Science and Faith, how do you find the practice of science and the Christian faith relating to one another in general and in your own life?
That's a wonderful question. I went to MIT undergraduate. When I first got there, I read a book called The Blind Watchmaker by Richard Dawkins. And he argued that when you look at nature, you may think you see design, but it's really just blind, undirected processes. It didn't really have you in mind or anything in mind. And I became pretty convinced at that point that Christianity and belief in God were just psychological crutches, that it's just people believed things blindly because they weren't very careful thinkers. They just were very credulous. And then I realized that that was a very serious problem, because if God doesn't exist, if we're simply an accident of nature, then life has no real meaning. That what'll happen, it doesn't matter if I'm kind or cruel. It doesn't matter if I'm happy or sad. I'll die, I'll cease to exist, and my memory will be gone. And eventually our universe will run out of free energy, like we talked about before, and all life would cease. So life is pointless. So I said, God, I don't know if you exist, but if you do exist, you have to prove it to me. And what happened is that really put me on quite a quest. And I really could see in retrospect how God guided my path, where I met people like Philip Johnson, who connected me with world-leading thinkers about design and nature. I met people that were experts in other areas. And that brought me back to faith. And I realized what happens, and this is a famous quote, that a little science can take a person away from God, but a lot of science brings them back. And I realized that the evidence for design in nature and life in the human body were so overwhelming. To deny the fact that our body is designed, you have to, as the Apostle Paul would say, you have to actively suppress the truth. So the fact I knew that I was designed by a creator, I then looked in other areas. I looked at things like the evidence for the resurrection and became convinced that the Christian faith is actually true. And it was both through my intellectual explorations and from actually encountering God supernaturally in his revelation that I came back to faith. And that's where I'm here today.
Dr. Miller, thank you very much for your time. It was an absolute joy. And to our listeners, thank you very much for taking the time to learn with us on current topics in science, where scientific discoveries are examined in light of the origins issue. You can find Dr. Miller's biographical information, his credentials, his written works in the description, where you'll also find links to his numerous video lectures and a link to the Christ Jesus Ministries merch store. Please share and subscribe to the Current Topics in Science podcast. It's available on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. Thanks again for listening, and remember, the truth saves.